I have just started the recording, so Jim can tell us about the Shanty Windrider.
What time is it? It's 11:14.
Okay.
Everybody.
We've got a difficult technical situation going on. I don't know whether you folks can hear me or not, but I had to give up sailing my Windrider because I was going to run into somebody's dock or something because I can't see where I'm going. And I actually had a close call with a high-speed powerboat. And so I pulled it up in the reeds and looked at it for a while and got feeling really blue about it. But I've been sailing her here for over 15 years on my little river in the southern Chesapeake that runs out to the Chesapeake Bay and even out in the ocean. And I had a wonderful time with that boat, but it was time to give it up. So I built a house on it that it's actually the ruination of a perfectly good sailboat. I had to take the rig off, and but I've got a sort of a floating campsite there that's big enough for 2 people to hang out in, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. I wish I could show you a picture of it now, but I will soon when we open my new podcast. I'm right on the verge of coming up with a new podcast. Some of you will remember that I had one about 4 years ago where I just did a bunch of marine storytelling and had a lot of fun with it. But in this instance, we can have images. I'm living on the very fringes of the internet here, but we have a new server, and so I think we're going to be able to broadcast images, both stills and video. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get onto Zoom calls. Right now, nobody can see me because of this circuitous connection that we have, but I do have a webcam, and I've been filming myself on video with a new iPhone, which I bought just for the camera. And so with the help of Carla and my partner Scott Brown up in Canada, who has collected something over 200 hours of video, we're going to start sharing this stuff with you folks. So this is a pretty rough beginning, but it is a beginning, and I'm glad to be here. Thanks a lot for coming, everybody. That's enough for me for now. I don't hear anybody.
I think we're here to listen to you. Keep going.
Oh. Well, I've had a nice visit recently from Andy Zimmerman, who is the guy that manufactured the Windriders. He was the kingpin at Wilderness Systems Kayaks when I first met him way back in the late 1990s. No, early 1990s. And we just bumped into each other at a company picnic down at Cedar Island, North Carolina. It's just at the south end of the Ocracoke ferry run. And he and his kayak company would have their company picnic down there once a year. And I was also great friends with Mark Baylog, who is the guy that manufactured the Boss rig, BOSS, Baylog outrigger stabilizing system, which allowed you to make a little trimaran out of practically any kayak. And I had known Mark for a long time, and they invited us to come down to their company picnic. and holy moly, they were both happening in the same campground on the same weekend. And that's how I bumped into Andy Zimmerman. And that was the inception of Windrider right there. So I was speaking with Andy recently. He's long since sold out his interest in paddle sports. Wilderness Systems evolved into Confluence Water Sports, which became a giant, probably the largest paddle sports manufacturer in the world. And Andy and his partner, John Shepard, had really busted their buns for years to make that thing grow like it did. There were years in there where they were almost doubling in size year after year. And one of the things that Andy discovered that really tended to drive sales was the introduction of new models. And his man, R&D guy, his name is Rick Jones, was an absolute maestro with a bucket of resin and a block of foam, and they could come up with a new design in about, it seemed like 15 minutes to me. And it drove their sales to the point where they had a huge industry going, a huge inventory, a large product line. And at about that time, I guess the early 1990s, Andy began to worry that the kayak business was going to peak out. And so he decided that he'd like to include a sailing arm in his business, have a line of sailing kayaks. So they started experimenting with sail-driven kayaks, and it took them a while. They went through a number of different prototypes and learned that the amount of power that you can deliver to the boat with a sail is far greater than what you can deliver with your arms. And so most of their sailing sea kayak attempts turned into submarines. They just literally sail them under. They could push them so much harder with sail when the wind blew. And so when we bumped into each other, me and Andy and his partner, John Shepard, we all met down there at Cedar Island. And Andy said, if you have any ideas, let me know. So what I'm giving you here is the inception of Windrider. I thought it might be a good place to stop. I hope somebody will stop me if it's time for somebody else to speak, or if anybody else has become connected. I hope Bruce is in on the action now. Bruce, are you there? Bruce Matlack. Anybody else there?
Not.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that's very frustrating for him. Although I didn't meet Bruce until, I guess it was into like 2003 or 4. So this is all ancient Windrider history I'm talking about now. Andy decided he was going to try to put a sailing division into his paddle sports company. And he asked me if I had any ideas. And I said, well, the guy you really ought to talk to is Dick Newick. He's done a lot more kayaking than I have. And furthermore, you could attach a really big multi-hull name to your product if you got Dick in on the act. Dick Newick, those of you who are not long-time multi-hullers may not recognize the name Dick Newick. He was probably, in my view, who was the most influential of all the early multi-hull designers. He's the guy that taught us how to go so very fast in such very rough water. Absolutely brilliant designer. So I referred Andy to Dick Newick, and Andy commissioned Dick to design a sailing boat for them. And Andy was very specific. he wanted something that Dick had never really heard of. He wanted a sailboat that you could sit down in like a kayak and steer with your feet. Now, this was, really pretty radical. And the trouble with it, in Dick's view, was that if you're sitting down in the main hull and steering with your feet, you can't hike out. And in a small boat, this was to be a 16-footer, in a small boat, you can't really drive it to maximum speed unless you hike out, because the weight of the sailor is such a large percentage of the weight of the whole boat. In fact, it may exceed the weight of the boat itself. So Dick designed Andy a boat that you could sit sort of crosswise in the main hull with your feet out on one platform and your body laying out on the other, so that in very light airs you could relax. But when the time came, you had to hike out. You had enough power in the sail plan so that you had to hike out. And Dick designed the boat, did a beautiful set of drawings, brought them to Andy, who was at that time located in High Point, North Carolina, not far from Greensboro in the center of the state there. And Andy looked over the plans and said, thanks very much, Dick. Here's your check for $10,000, which was the agreed design commission. And we'll be letting you know. So Dick went away. And about this time, it was time for the next year's company picnics. So we all met up down there, not Dick, but me and Andy and Mark Baylog and John Shepard and the whole early Wilderness Systems tribe. And they were a bunch of people that could really go in a picnic, I'll tell you. So anyway, Andy came to me and he said, we designed a boat for Dick, but he didn't give us what we wanted. I told him I wanted to be able to sit down inside the boat and steer with your feet. And Dick just didn't think that was a viable way to do it. And so, gee, Jim, if you have any ideas, we'd still be interested. And I thought, oh, man, Dick and I were very close friends, had been for a long time by that time. And son of a gun, I really didn't want to step in on his toes, but Andy said, no, I know just what I want. I don't want a sailing sea kayak, and I don't want a beach cat. I want the sea kayak of sailing. And I thought that was an interesting distinction. Some of you have probably heard this story before. I probably talked about it in my earlier podcast. But anyway, I went home and started building models. And the third model that I took down to High Point to show to Andy and John, the third one was a dead ringer for what we now call the Windrider 16. And so that was the inception. That's how it all started. So I'm wondering if anybody has any questions, or I can take off from there.
Well, Jim, if I can pipe in for one moment, that's HB.
Hello.
I just have a funny story for you. It was that kayak sailing boat, this Windrider 16, that I first sailed down in Kerala, the Outer Banks. It was sitting on the shore of was it like an Airbnb type thing or a rental house? And I walked up to the guy and he said, well, nobody's using it. And I said, well, let me try that thing. I took it out for about 10 minutes. Absolutely loved it. I sailed back over, and our house that we had rented was about half a mile up the shore. And I said, do you mind if I take this thing down and show my wife and kids? And he said, you can have it for the whole week. Nobody sails it. Now, I don't know if that was kind of a foreshadow for what was to come for me, but I took that thing and I sailed the hull up of it all week. And I took it back to the guy, and I didn't know you or the company at the time. And I said, the funny thing is about this boat, the only thing it needs and that this was not a complaint, I said, these would be a little firmer. It needs a stayed mast. So that's a lead-in for you. I'll leave it there. But I enjoyed that 16 for a week. It was the late 90s, probably a year or two into the sales. But what a wonderful boat, and it set my eye on anything Windrider from that point on.
Well, how good. Jeez, I'm so glad that guy loaned you that boat.
Yep, I was too.
That's wonderful.
I've owned the 17 now for 20-some years.
Uh-huh. Well, that 16-footer, I've always enjoyed sailing the 16-footer more than the 17-footer. She had some nasty things about her when she was overdriven, but if one would take the trouble to really work out the reefing arrangement and just reef when the boat started turning into a submarine, you could handle very strong winds and very big waves with it. My wife and I took it all over the country one summer on a trailer. We were up in Nova Scotia with it, and I got caught out in a really nasty blow. It was one of the very few times I've had a really close call in a boat. But I got it back in. I had a tremendous respect for the thing to be able to handle very hard wind and very big waves if reefed. And the owner's manual never really went into enough detail about reefing. What should have been the headline was "Practice reefing in a calm," you know. I think the reason we couldn't get people to reef was they thought it would slow them down, but actually reefing when it's needed does not slow the boat down. It speeds it up, and it takes the white knuckles out of the thing. You're not driving it under, and that's the truth with any boat, even a 100-footer. If you reef when it's needed, the boat will go faster than when it's not reefed. But anyway, those of you who have 16s, it's important to in order to be able to reef properly, one has to secure the two halves of the mast together at the joint in the middle of the mast. That is, when you plug one end into the other, you got to put a piece of duct tape or gorilla tape around that seam so that the upper end of the mast cannot rotate relative to the lower end. And then once the sail is on the mast and you've got it pulled all the way down to the gooseneck and it's snug at the head with the top of the mast stuck firmly into the top of the sock in the sail, the sleeve in the sail, at that point you need something at the masthead to engage with the sail so that when the mast rotates, the sail cannot rotate on the mast. And the easiest thing to do is just to drive a sheet wall screw right through the sleeve in the mast, the sleeve in the sail, right into the cap in the masthead so that the sail cannot rotate up there, and neither can the mast itself rotate at the furl in the middle of it there. Now, when you rotate the mast from down on deck at the mast partner, when you rotate it there, you do get a proper wind-up around the mast with the sail's sleeve. The sleeve cannot turn into a barber pole arrangement, which really destroys the shape of the sail and makes it impossible to really drive the boat to windward in a hard blow. But if the sail will reef, that's either the old sail or the new sail. If it'll reef without barber poling around the mast, you've got a boat there that'll definitely tolerate very heavy weather. I'm talking about ocean waves where most of them are breaking, white horses, and gusts of, I'm being honest with you, gents, 40 knots. That is enough wind to start blowing the tops off of the waves so you can't see where you're going. And you can still chip away at it and get that little baby to go to windward to get you out of trouble. and so there's a lot of information about the 16 that needs to be out there. And I always enjoyed sailing it more than the 17, but the trouble with it was that I couldn't take my dog. So I got the 17-footer, and like you, I spent years sailing the 17 until my dog up and died, and I got so I couldn't see where I was going and all that, There's more to say about that if anybody wants to hear it. Am I still connected with you all?
I can hear you, Jim.
Yeah, you are. Yes.
Yeah?
Keep going.
Okay. I sold my 16-footer to my neighbor who lives 4 doors down the little river from me here. A guy named Eric P. I get to see him often. And I told him that when I took the 17's rig off, when I took the rig off of my 17-footer, I had this rig laying around. I took it off so that I could put on the shanty boat thing, which I call the box turtle. And Carla and I will tell you all about the box turtle when we get the podcast going. But anyway, I had this rig kicking around. And I told Eric that if he wanted to experiment around and play with this thing, we could work it out to put the 17-footer's rig on the 16-footer. And his eyes lit up. I knew we could do it because I had done it once before. Years before I had done it, one Christmas time when my son Russell was home here visiting with us, we took the rig off of my 17 and put it on the 16, got it worked out. We had to build another rudder. It needed a much more powerful rudder with all that sail area aft of where it had been in the original rig. But we did get it set up, stayed in the same way as the rig is stayed on the 17, but with no jib. It was to be an Una rig, just the rotating mast and the fully battened mainsail. And I took that thing out and sailed it around and realized that it only took me about 15 seconds to figure out that we had a completely different boat under us here. And the reasons for it are rather complicated. Without having a model in front of me that I can use as a prop to demonstrate, let me get a little wordy about explaining the difference here between the 17-footer and the 16-footer. It has to do with what we call global torsion. And I had no idea that when we got into building boats out of polyethylene, which I call bubble gum, that we were going to have such an extreme problem with the boat twisting. That is, if you were to grab the model, let's say you grab the starboard float in one hand and the port float in the other, and I'll hold the model up here in front of you, and I'll push down on the starboard float bow and lift up on the port float bow, you can see that if the boat if the main hull was made out of a flexible material, that you'd be twisting it. You'd be applying what back in the early multi-hull days we used to call the dish rag effect. We were not engineers. We didn't know about global torsion. This was the dish rag effect of wringing out the main hull. Well, in the case of the 16-footer, there's a lot more strain evident than in the 17-footer for this reason. When I say strain, I'll be strict about it and say, first of all, there's stress. The stress is the force that's applied to try to twist the boat. And the strain is the movement or the extent to which the material deforms under stress. And of course, because the thing is built just like a garbage can, you can definitely deform it, And in fact, anyone who has a 16-footer, if you get somebody sitting in the cockpit and two more to help, somebody lifting up on one float bow and somebody else lifting up on the other float stern, you can practically deform that main hull in the cockpit area so much that the guy can hardly get out of the cockpit. You're really winding up the boat. It's that flexible. So when I got into messing around with polyethylene, which I had never done before, and in fact I had never worked for a manufacturer before, all of my boats were either built by professional builders on contract or else mostly by their owners from stock plans. The repeat sale of stock plans to backyard builders was my bread and butter. And when it came time to work for a manufacturer, I had to learn that it was up to me to become as flexible as polyethylene, man. I had to do a lot of backbending to get along with these guys on a design level. And one of them was with regard to all of this flexibility. So when it came time to design a rig for the 16-footer, Andy and John didn't like the rig that I designed. They wanted something else, and so we ended up with an unstayed mast that steps through the deck some out there. I think it's 14 inches forward of the forward crossbeam. And we had, I tried to tell them that, if you really want to wind up the boat, you're going to try to step the mast not on the forward crossbeam. You're going to try to ask the hull, that space in the hull between the mast step and its partner and its step down in the keel, that distance between there and the forward crossbeam, that area is going to receive an enormous amount of torsion, much greater than polyethylene can tolerate. And poor John Shepard and I really had it out over that one, and I finally said, well, you're the boss, John. I mean, you're making this thing. You better go ahead and make it the way you want. And so he made a mold for a great thing. It looked like a horse collar, that a small one that would fit up into the bow of the 16-footer, and the mast would step down through it. And did we lose somebody? I guess that's okay. That mast step did not work, and poor John had to go through a lot of trouble to devise an aluminum weldment that would actually brace the mast step tube to the forward crossbeam tube. And as you look inside the builds of a 16-footer, you can see that thing in there. It's a significant piece of metal work, and it's very difficult to get it in there during assembly. It weighs a lot, but it does the job. I didn't think it was going to work, but it has done the job just fine. I've never heard of one breaking, and John Shepard designed that thing. But what it does in the unstayed rig is that it delivers all of the heeling effort that's developed by the mast and sail. It delivers it directly to the forward crossbeam, period. It goes no farther than that. All of that heeling effort is delivered to the forward crossbeam. And, of course, that means that the forward crossbeam, during when sailing and when heeling, when there's a lot of heeling effort on the boat, such as when driving hard to windward, that forward crossbeam gets pushed down without, that is, the downwind end of that crossbeam pushes down on the float deck. We're talking about the 16-footer now. It pushes down on the float deck on the forward end of the float only, because by the time that heeling effort gets to the after crossbeam, through the space between that's inhabited only by a bubblegum boat, that means that the after crossbeam does not push down on the float stern anything like it should. And that means that because the boat twists, it puts the downwind float in a negative angle of attack, and of course it dives. Furthermore, when it dives, something that we learned the hard way about polyethylene is this stuff called differential shrinkage. Polyethylene boats shrink during cure. As they cool off, they shrink. And because of the shape of the bows in the 16-footer, that elliptical, vertical ellipse going forward, that thing is vulnerable to differential shrinkage. That is, it shrinks along its upper and lower edges where there's a sharp corner. Those corners tend to pull themselves together during cooling off. And so the bows of both the main hull and the float have nothing like the buoyancy that I designed into them and that was built into the mold. Because of differential shrinkage, the forward end of the 16-footer doesn't have anything like the buoyancy it's supposed to have, especially when you're diving underwater, because the hydrostatic pressure squeezes the thing and squeezes out still more buoyancy, which is why the 16-footer tends to dive its bow. Now, if we shift to the 17-footer and talk about the stays, you know how the rigging that goes sideways. Stays run sideways, shrouds run sideways, stays run fore and aft. So there's the jib stay, but the shrouds that run out to the float turn to a bridle before they get to the float, and that bridle leads to both crossbeams. So now, when you heel the 17-footer, when you start to drive that baby to windward, the rigging is pulling up on the upwind end of both crossbeams, and that pushes down on both ends of the leeward float. So we are using the whole length of the float in the 17-footer. Furthermore, I designed a whole lot more buoyancy in the float bow in the 17-footer because it was going to have a bigger rig. So if we take the 17-footer's rig and put it on the 16-footer, what we have to do is move the mast step back to the crossbeam. That is, in this boat that belongs to my neighbor, there is a ball for stepping the mast on the forward crossbeam. We've moved the mast back some 14 inches, and we have stayed it forward to the main hull bow with no jib, and the shrouds were run out to each float, and because of the bridle, they lift up on both crossbeams more or less equally. And that means that what we can do with the 16-footer, when we stick the 17-footer's rig on it, we can eliminate the twist. The global torsion in the main hull goes pretty much away, and we are now using the full length of the float. And so the thing doesn't nosedive. And with that great big sail up there, much bigger than the 16-footer sail, furthermore, it's fully battened, and furthermore, it has a rotating mast. The power that thing generates on the 16-footer is, I don't know, 3 or 4 times greater than you can get out of those funky sails they ended up putting on the stock 16-footer. They're very easy to use. They're wonderfully handy. I love them, but they're not powerful for their area. So anyway, there is such a thing as a Windrider 16 with a 17's rig on it, and all you need is a much more powerful rudder and the thing turns into a hot rod. I called it the 16 Turbo. I tried to sell it to the company that had bought the Windrider assets. By now, Andy and John had sold out, and there was another outfit that had the assets to the Windrider company, including the molds and the rigs and everything. And they could have easily turned the Windrider 16 into a turbo version that would have been a humdinger of a boat. But they didn't hear me. You know, they had their own ideas about what they were going to do, and bless them, at least the thing didn't die at that point. The company went on and was sold again to another outfit, and that's a whole nother story, and Bruce Matlack will tell you that one someday, I guess. Anyway, that's enough out of me. How are you guys doing? Anybody have any questions?
The only thing I thought, this is Dave, the only thing I thought to ask was a two-part question about how your influence on sailing, but also sailing's influence on you. How, all the years building and sailing multi-hulls, how do you think your life is different because there was so much of that versus had your life not had any of that in it?
Gee, we're not talking about Windriders now. Do you want me to get into the philosophy of this thing?
Well, if you'd like to, if others are interested, it's fine with me. It's just I think that I'm not solely, since we're talking to the oldest living multi-hull lunatic and not just about Windriders.
We ought to explain that to the other guys. Yeah, when we started out in multi-hulls, when I got into it back in the 1950s, the mid-50s, it had already been going for about 10 years. The Hawaiian Cats preceded the California Trimarans by about 10 years. But when I got into it in California, of course, the local yachts people called us multi-hullers. We were the lunatic fringe, and so the subtitle to my upcoming podcast is "Oldest Multi-Hull Lunatic Tells All." And it's quite something to be. All my old early multi-hull friends are gone. I'm not sure. I think probably Lauren Williams is still living. He hasn't been active in multi-hulls for a long time, but he was in on it in the early Piver days, mid to late 1950s. I hope Lauren is still living. I'd love to hear from him. I don't know where he is. But Rich Gerling is also still living. I've been in touch recently, and I have a bunch of wonderful photos to share with Rich. It's to share with you from Rich Gerling, who was the Viking-like sailor that was Arthur Piver's principal crew for most of his transocean voyaging and building. Rich did a lot of building for Art Piver too. But I'm the last one left. I'm older than both of them, I guess, and I'm the only one that's willing to take the time to try to tell the story. And so I suppose that speaks to the philosophy. I feel like, at least as far as boats are concerned, it's been a life well lived. I once was complaining to a sculptor friend of mine, a great sculptor, Gordon Newell, a guy who has a piece on the White House lawn, etc. Gordon was a brilliant artist guy, and I was complaining to him about what a hard time I was having trying to make a living in the boat business. And he thought for a minute and smiled and said, "Well, I don't know, Jim. I think, it might be hard to do better than boats." And so that stuck with me. And all of the designing and the sailing and stuff that I've done has been no different than what any other serious designer, builder, sailor goes through, except for one main thing. The one thing that has really made a difference to me in my nautical bent has been the ability of a boat to take one from point A to point B, not from point A back to point A, but to actually get one's affairs in order sufficient to make it possible to hit the big briny, find yourself way offshore in the dark with nobody around, following the compass, following your logic, trying to use the sextant to figure out where you're going to come in, and then have the experience of the destination, particularly if it's another culture, another language, another climate, another topography, but most of all, different people that think differently, think in ways that we don't normally think. So many Americans who have done, they think of as a lot of traveling as a tourist, don't pick up on this particular aspect that I'm speaking of. One must stop, get off the boat, move ashore, live ashore, work ashore, learn to speak ashore, and then get back on the boat and have that destination, that port of call, isolated from the next destination by time at sea. It's like, Star Wars, living on a different planet. You go out in the ocean, boy, and it's someplace else. We are not evolved for that stuff. And it takes a huge adjustment, both psychologically and physiologically, to get to feel at home out in the ocean. And I took the whole trip. That is, I not only designed the boat, but built it, and then put my young family aboard and really hit the big briny. We did that just enough, not nearly as much as many of my clients have done. I haven't sailed nearly as far or been to nearly as many foreign places as many of my clients have. But I think of that as the keystone of the nautical experience. It's cultural more than it is physical and technical. And yet, of course, you don't get one without the other.
Sounds like you answered kind of the question in a philosophical sense. Where has the boat taken you? And that's a good answer.
Yeah, and not just me. It's my wife and our two sons. Both of our boys were here recently. They're in their early 60s, which is a jolt. When you think about that, you imagine having a kid in his early 60s. Yeah.
It's not possible, is it?
Well, it has been for me. I've been very fortunate. I'm 89 now and not doing badly. And my wife and I are looking back on 63 years together, and looking back on 65 or more years of direct involvement with multi-hulls, and we're looking back on about 75 years of modern multi-hullism. There's a distinct difference between modern multi-hulls and ancient multi-hulls, and that departure, that separation between the two happened in Hawaii right after World War II, and the main difference between the ancient multi-hulls and the modern multi-hulls, there was an enormous difference. Don't get me wrong. The main difference started because of the materials that were available to the early post-war Hawaiian designers, and we have to, of course, identify primarily Woody Brown, who, in my view, was the real progenitor of the modern multi-hull, because he built one and launched it in 1947 using modern wooden aircraft materials and technology. He was not only a sailor, he was also an aviator, and a highly skilled aviator in sailplanes. And and he was also an early big wave surfboard rider. One of the first guys to go out on the really big waves out there on the north side of Oahu. And and so Woody Brown brought a combination of disciplines together with readily available new materials to the multi-hull notion in about 1947. And it was at that point where the technology took a giant leap for mankind. And what's happened since, it's just been absolutely meteoric, the technical development that I'm looking back on. It's incredible, the advancements that have been made. Even in the 1950s, we saw Piver and I and Lauren Williams and Rich Gerling, we all, Fred Jukic, Piver's old friend, Fred Jukic, who was such a great sailor. We all thought that the multi-hull thing was so vastly superior to what we've been doing. And most of us had extensive monohull experience at that time. At least Piver did, and I did. Extensive schooner bumming in my case, and we came out of we were steeped in monohull seafaring, and we were able to judge that the multi-hull configuration was in our view, so superior, so different, so new, such a fresh boating experience that it actually changed one's attitude about the sea. One's philosophical approach to the sea was changed by this modern new implement that was actually acculturated out of World War II, and Woody Brown having the opportunity to observe the ancient multi-hulls at work in the Pacific during the war. It was definitely an Asiatic concept that was acculturated into our so-called Western ways, starting with that incredible guy, Woody Brown, in the mid-40s. And incidentally, Woody Brown and Hobie Alter were friends, and of course it was the Beach Cat that really started to take multi-hulls toward the mainstream. But the interesting thing to me about the first modern multi-hull, at least in my view, was Woody Brown's Manu Kai, a 36 or 37 foot Beach Cat that operated to and from Waikiki with joyriders aboard. It was designed and built as a business. It was not a yacht. It was not a plaything. It was a commercial vessel. And it was Woody Brown's meal ticket for the next 40 years. And so I would like to point out that all of the wonderful recreational sailing that we have enjoyed in the succeeding 75 years is a big part of the story for us, and it illustrates how boats, along with all of the other implements of the material culture in which we've lived, they really are, those implements are a product of their times. And so much of the multi-hull product has been focused on recreation and or racing. I suppose you can call racing recreation. I don't think of it as much fun myself, but especially ocean racing. I've never been for it in a multi-hull. I think it's particularly the single-handing, but the thing I'm trying to say here is that it's been our times, our human experience in the last 75 years that has resulted in the multi-hulls of today, most of which are recreational. There's an awful lot of little boats around like Wind Riders and all the other beach cats. My gosh, I think they figured at one point there were something like 20,000 beach cats, if you include Hobies and all of their ilk, that had been built. All of them, right on up through the Transocean racers and the charter boats, both the day charter boats and the term charter vessels, the excursion boats, the ferry boats, the military multi-hulls. All of those are products of their time. And what fascinates me these days is sitting here knowing that it's not all that far to the end of the world or to the end of the road for me. In fact, I had a little heart attack the other day. It was quite a red flag event. I seem to have come out of it just fine. I can't feel a bit of difference, but anyway, it was a wake up, to cast my thoughts forward. I'm just really digging, trying to figure out what the multi-hulls of the future are going to look like. If we can go forward any amount of time we want, fellas, we can think of, let's say, some of you have been involved in multi-hulls since Wind Rider came out. The first one, the 16-footer came out in 1996. The 17-footer in 2002. Well, let's just say it's 25 years or 20 years since you've been involved in multi-hulls. If the Wind Rider was your first, okay, think of another 20 years. Imagine what multi-hulls are going to be like then. And you can't imagine, nobody can predict the future for sure, but we can look back on the trend of human well-being in whatever period of time you want to choose and try to fathom the enormous differences between the early modern multis and the late modern multis, and extend that on out another 20 years, or let's just say, to the end of, to the middle of the century, and then to the end of the century. Think of the incredible things that are likely to happen for multi-hulls in that time span. And you can't think of that without examining the human condition. Since the end of World War II, boy, have we ever been on a wild ride, huh? If we think about the anthropologists love to talk about the human condition. I think of it as the human predicament. we got ourselves in a jam, you guys. You know, if you start to add up the things that are hanging over humanity's head these days, it's enough to think. You think, well, geez, if any of that stuff were to happen, what's it going to be like, and what can I do as an individual to either prevent it or accelerate it or survive through it and come out the other side? We've got to start thinking about that stuff. We don't have to call it doomsday. It better not be. I hope the hell it isn't. I don't think it will be, but I think it may be time to sort of think about what's coming. And one way to think about it is to try to design a multi-hull that would belong in that time, whatever time it is we want to look forward to. And that's kind of what I'd like to do with my podcast, and I'd be pleased to hear from you guys as to what you think of the idea.
Well, Jim, my name's Marcia Fraser. Can you hear me down there?
I can. Hello,
Hi.
Marcia.
Hello,
do you have a Wind Rider?
I do. I have a 17 up here in Vermont on Lake Champlain.
Hey.
And it's not the first trimaran I've owned. It'd probably be the last one I own. But I have a story to share with you I think you'll appreciate.
Oh.
My first winter on a multi-hull was 1985. I was on a Sea Runner 31 owned by a friend of mine. And we were sailing along the north coast of Jamaica. Downwind, heavy wind, which was building. We were surfing really, really fast. And we're about to turn into Discovery Bay on the north coast of Jamaica. And, of course, I had a fishing line out. And you know how that is. You always catch the fish just before you're about to come into the bay. And all I had a yo-yo and an oven mitt to pull in this big fish that I caught that ended up being a tuna. Somehow or other, I got that thing on the deck. I got it into the dinghy, which was a Zodiac. I had to sit on the fish to keep it from jumping around. It was because it was a big fish. And my friend Roger was driving the boat, and we had to take that left turn going into Discovery Bay, which we came into full sails. And so we're flying into this bay. We came flying in. By that time, the fish had calmed down, dropped the sails, dropped the hook, backed off the hook. And a dinghy came out to greet us from shore. Who's in that dinghy but Steve Brown, your son Steve, and a friend of his, Lance. And you probably know this story. He was there in Discovery Bay helping Lance to rebuild his boat, which was a catamaran that had gone on the rocks because somebody had cut his line and they ended up on the rocks.
Yeah, no, that was a trimaran too.
It was, yes. I don't remember the name of it, though.
Nereis.
Nereis, that's right, right. I bumped into that boat years later, somewhere in the Bahamas, I think. It was owned by a German. They weren't particularly friendly. But anyway, so that was my first encounter with Steve. And then a couple years later, I had my own boat. It was a 31.5 Nimble that had been stretched and widened by a friend of mine who built it. And I was in, where the heck was I? Oh, I was in the Keys, and I bumped into Steve again. And we chatted for a bit. And, you know, we just coincidentally were in the same place. And I lived on that boat for 8 years. Name is Oktui. When you talk next to Steve, send him my regards. The name of the boat was Oktui, Auktui. He'll remember. Because then another time, a few years after that, when Steve was on Cape Cod building a catamaran, Hurricane Gloria came blowing through. So he came up to Vermont with his friend, and they spent a couple days here to escape the Hurricane Gloria. So we have a bit of a history, but I haven't seen Steve for years. And I'm absolutely shocked to hear you say that your two sons are in their 60s. That makes me really, really old.
Well, that's a great, what a small world, huh?
No kidding, no kidding. And I'm sure there are other people that we know in common, but Steve's probably the closest one to you for sure.
Well, can you give me your name again? I want to talk to him about this.
Sure. It's Marcia, Marsha.
Yeah.
Fraser, Fraser, and the boat name was Auktui, Auktui.
God, how do you translate that name? Do you know?
Well, the boat was built by a guy on Cape Cod, and he hadn't named it yet. There were some kids bouncing around in the dunes out there, just saying Auktui, Auktui, and that's how he named the boat. So it didn't really mean anything.
I thought it meant something in Austronesian or something.
Well, there is the great auk, and I guess there's a bird called too, but I think that's more coincidence than anything else.
Yeah, well, Marcia, it's really great to talk to you. Where on Lake Champlain are you?
Way up in the northwest corner in a town called Alberg. We face New York. We face west. Have a little camp up there. And there's one other 17 on Lake Champlain, south of us, I know.
Well, that's where I learned to love boats.
Really?
On the Vermont side at Mallett's Bay on Lake Champlain. It's just below the capital.
Well, it's just north of Burlington, Mallett's Bay is, or just northwest, east of it. In fact, that's where the other Wind Rider is on the lake. She sails out of Mallett's Bay.
Well, I know that guy too.
Blaine?
No, well, maybe it's not that guy. Well, gee, I was a little kid up there. My dad was from Vermont, from St. Albans, up on the border. And he and his brother had a little camp there on Mallett's Bay where I spent the summers, age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in there. And I really learned to love boats there. It's a wonderful piece of water.
It is, for sure. That's interesting. I didn't know that you had that connection with Vermont. That's great.
Yeah, my dad was a Vermonter, and he was not a sailor, but he always was supportive of my bent to go messing around in the ocean.
They might as well be.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to hear your voice, and I'm enjoying this, and I look forward to listening to your podcast as well, Jim.
Well, thank you very much. I hope some of my old friends come back, and that we get some new listeners, which I think we'll get because we've got these images now. We got a lot to share.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Great. Thanks again.
Thank you. Hey, thank you. Fair winds. I guess you won't be doing much sailing now until spring.
No, the boat's on the trailer in the yard right now.
Yeah.
With, of course, the new mast step.
Oh.
Well, when I bought it, the mast step had been broken by the prior owner. It does happen with those pins, and they forget to pull the pin when they drop the mast, and it breaks that metal plate.
It's the casting that fits into the foot of the mast?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you can still sail with that thing broken.
I did actually do that. It was a little more exciting than I wanted. I was bouncing around quite a bit. And anyway, that was an exciting day because the cable to the rudder broke too. So it was made for some interesting steering. But
yeah. Well, incidentally, I'm in favor of replacing those cables with spectral line, 1/8 inch spectral line.
Right. I hear you. I've done that actually.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Fair winds, Marcia. Thanks so much for chiming in. And anybody else out there hearing us yet? Maybe we're the last ones alive.
My little window tells me we have 9 people in the meeting. So.
Really? Well, hello. Hey, hail to all you.
Hey, we're still out here.
Okay. Hail to all you Wind Riders. I got to say, it just pleases me enormously that there is such a thing as a Windrider owners group.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a huge community. It amazes me, Lance. I have that YouTube channel and the amount of people that track me down, Windrider people, through that. You know, because I'm a fat guy with a YouTube channel, I somehow become the god of the thing. So everyone comes to me for questions. But it amazes me how much how much people are into it.
Well, I must explain that for anybody that doesn't already know it, is that I can't see for beans, and it's quite tedious for me to use a computer. But I do have a program called ZoomText that allows me to magnify the screen easily by rolling the mouse wheel. Mouse wheel zooming is a wonderful thing for anybody on a computer, and because you can keep one hand on the mouse and the other hand on the keyboard. Anyway, that program ZoomText will also read to me out loud. And so if you guys want to get me in on the conversation, I'd be glad to be there, but I can't text. I can't see well enough to use a touch screen. And so we'll have to do it by email, at least for the time being. And I'm going to give you my email address right now. If you don't have it, it's pretty easy. You know, our whole project is called Outrig, OUTRIG. It's not Outrigger. It's just Outrig.
What's up, my Outrigger?
Uh-huh.
Ooh, I forgot. I'm on mic. I'm sorry.
Uh-huh.
Mute that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Outrig.org @gmail.com. And this podcast, Carla's going to post it in several different ways, I think in 2 or 3 different places, but you'll always be able to get it at my website, which is outrigmedia.com. So email outrig.org @gmail, and then the website is Outrig Media. And there's some on the home page of the website. There's some tabs across the top, and one of them is podcasts. And from that, we'll be able to get to the old podcasts and the new ones if we can ever get things sufficiently organized. And I'd be pleased to hear from you if you're having problems with your boats or you have any stories to share. Really, I want the new podcast to be about stories too. And the great thing this time is that we'll be able to illustrate them. We can put in pictures and talk about the pictures and talk with each other and all that. I'm quite excited about getting in on it. I confess that I'm doing this for myself. Of course, it's stuff that I want to share with you all, but I'm told that an old geezer like me really needs to be in touch with a community of some kind. And of course, the multi-hull community is where I belong. And I'm also told that I need a purpose, a sense of purpose. And the only one I can think of, the only thing I'm good for is to share all of this boating claptrap that I've managed to accumulate over 65 years.
Hey, Jim, it's HP. I just wanted to pipe in and say thank you because you are a senior statesman. I've been in your audience 3 times and with 20 or more people, one time at Duck, North Carolina, down at Sarasota, Florida. And you mesmerize and have everybody's ear when you speak. So it is for you, but it is also for us. And we enjoy the stories.
Well, how good. HP, how can I remember you? Did we go sailing together or something?
We did. We met first at Duck, at John Britt's place, the Norbanks there, with one of the Nationals, the Windrider National that John tried to get. And that was still when
anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, yes.
Can anybody hear me now?
Yep. I hear you.
I hear you.
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I pushed the mute button on my mic here.
We hear you,
I
Jim.
apologize for dropping out.
That's all right. Back to what I was
So
saying.
HP, did we know each other? I remember the Sarasota event. That was a kick in the pants.
That was great. That was a wonderful event for Windrider. But no, we met in Duck, North Carolina at John Britt's place in Norbanks, and that was the first time I played with you. Early 2000s, maybe late, early 2000s, I believe.
Well, I'm sure it's killing Bruce Matlack not to be in on this, but that's where I met Bruce.
I believe so. Yep, Bruce was there as well. Yep.
He's the guy that now has my old cruising trimaran, Scrimshaw.
Yep, I know Bruce.
And the news is that Scrimshaw came through this hurricane with very little consequence.
Great news.
Tied up right there where the storm went over, but she made it through.
Wow.
And thanks to Bruce's careful location of the boat up in a canal, freshwater canal. And let's see, Bruce and his gal Carla Laney and Bruce are an item, and Carla is the one that's putting a lot of this together for me as a technical assistant, and anyone who needs a social media assistant, think about Carla, because she understands where we windbags are coming from. Carla, what are you going to call your outfit?
No, Jim, I don't need any customers. I'm trying to find help for you.
Oh,
so, yeah. I'm Carla, and Bruce is with his other lady this weekend, Scrimshaw, in a very rural area that was hit by the hurricane. So unfortunately, he was unable to get the bandwidth to log on. But I've been listening the entire time, Jim, and part of it, when you were talking about the torsion, was starting to hurt my brain. But I did understand the big picture. But anyway, yes, I am more focused on windsurfing, and just started my own page called Wind Wizard Studios. But it's really focused on windsurfing, but then I changed it from windsurfing to wind so that I could include Jim, and also foiling, which I fell in love with at Hood River this summer. But anyway, I digress. So if anyone, I heard someone say they have a YouTube channel, Jim's isolated, he needs technical assistance, even if it's just telling these stories and someone records it, or figure out creative ways to help him tell his stories, because that's what he wants to do. And I was just mesmerized. So my little word from your sponsor is over. So maybe we can all chat amongst ourselves. And thanks.
Hey, thank you, Carla. Good. Yeah, maybe it's time for us to close this caper, but I'll tell a little story about Andy Zimmerman. I was talking with him just day before yesterday, and I asked him if he wanted to. Pardon me a second, please. When I talk too long, I get a frog in my throat. Can you hear me again? Anybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Andy was saying that he didn't want to join the group because he didn't have anything to sell anymore. And he wasn't trying to sell Windriders, and furthermore, that all he wanted to do was to sail his. He's recently found himself a piece of property down on the North Carolina coast where he'll be able to build a dock, and he's going to put Windriders and other multi-hulls at this dock. And he says that it's getting to be hard to find a Windrider, and he wants everybody to know that his is not for sale at any price. that you can try to take my girl away, but you better not try to take my Wind Rider. You know, and I mean, talk about commitment. You know, that's going a bit far with it. And when we get it together, I'll be able to show you some pictures of the box turtle. And meanwhile, I think that's maybe where I'll spend the rest of the afternoon. I have my Alexa unit out there, and I've sure been enjoying the music.
All right.
Hey, thanks a lot. Those are people signing off.
I got a 2002 and a 2016, so I got the whole gamut covered, and I enjoy the boats. Thank you very much.
Really? Okay. You have a 2002 17-footer?
Yes, both 17s. I got a 2002 and a 2016.
Wow.
So I got bookends.
Uh-huh. Does your 16 have the cutoff stern? 2016, the newer one?
Yes, it does.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe we should talk some
side by side. It's interesting to have them on the trailer side by side and go through the differences and see the evolution difference.
Yeah. Geez. You know, with that molding stuck on to the back end of it, there's an opportunity there for you to arrange for a kick-up rudder if you need one. We could talk about that if you're interested.
I'd be interested in that. Yeah, I'm doing the Gulf Coast down here. There's a lot of shallows I'm dealing with.
Uh-huh. Well, one reason the Wind Rider never took off on the California coast with the Beach Cat crowd was that with the fixed rudder, they had a bad time launching through the surf. And those numbskulls that cut the stern off of the mold in order to fit the big part into their oven for roto molding, they cut it on that cockeyed angle, but I still think that it might be possible to arrange for that whole bustle to kick up with the rudder.
Ooh, interesting. The whole pod come up, you mean?
Yeah, I think we might be able to design some stainless steel hardware that you could reach in and bolt on in order to make a hinge, and then we'd have to get creative for a downline, a way to pull that thing down and hold it down.
Yes.
But and a way to pull it up and hold it up. You know, there'd be some strings involved. But if you have to launch through the surf, or if you're sailing in a lot of shoal water, and you need a kick-up rudder, we could probably work it out.
Interesting idea. All right, now you got my brain thinking.
Okay. Okay, hey, I'm going to sign off, gents. Great for you to check in on this deal here. I hope we can make something out of it and keep going with the idea. And thanks so much to Carla and to you, Dave, for putting it together for us. Geez, what a wonderful thing for you to spend your Saturday doing. I'm grateful.
Been a fun
Fair
week.
winds to you all. Bye-bye.